I'm Ruth Ann Hammond. I'm a Rye Associate, student of Magda Gerber. I started as a Rye parent, and because of the transformation that Rye gave me, I became a Rye Associate, and I've been an infant toddler facilitator for close to 20 years now. So I teach in Pasadena and all over. Spent some time teaching Rye principles in China and Singapore this past summer, and I will be offering a local Rye Foundations course in Pasadena in the fall if you're nearby. So thank you for coming. And
I'm Patty Ryan. I'm Patty Ryan. My home is in Sacramento, California, where I do a lot of work with some folks. We call ourselves the Core 4, now the Core 6 in Sacramento, where we're trying to bring Rye to Northern California and offer Rye trainings in a variety of venues. And there's a lot of people from SAC here today, and that's exciting. I currently live in Beijing, China, with my husband and my daughter, my 15-year-old daughter, and we've been there for 2 years. With the help of Ruth Ann, we're going to be doing some work in China, bringing Rye to Asia, and we have some Chinese colleagues here today. If any of you run into them, I appreciate it if you greet them. They're lovely women, and they've come a long way to learn about Rye. So I'll be returning home in about 6 weeks, and I studied with Magda Gerber about 15 years ago and have been a Rye Associate. Studied with Magda about 17 years ago, been a Rye Associate for 15 years.
so today we're going to be doing some really, really deep thinking here. And normally, we like to have a lot of interactions and, give you some experientials to cement your learning and, make it a little more fun. But I have to tell you, this is a heady piece we're getting into here. And normally, I don't read PowerPoint slides. But today, there's going to be some of that because there's a logical progression of our points that we're trying to make, and we don't want to miss any beats. So please indulge us and try to stay with us, because I think today, we're going to bring ourselves to a deeper level of understanding of kind of where we are in the world right now vis-a-vis infants and what's going on with infants. So first of all, we're just close your eyes. Don't even look at those pictures. Those are just something to put on the slide. And imagine we're going to imagine this is two cultures. First culture. You're cared for at all times by someone who is deeply concerned with your well-being and your future. You're fed with fresh, seasonal, and organic foods. You are educated according to your interests and talents by your family and others interested members of the community to prepare you for adult life. And no one makes you do something just because they want you to. You are taught good behavior through example. Your mistakes and bad behavior are graciously ignored and forgiven. You're allowed to play whenever you want to, and you can join grown-up life when you feel ready, and your work is equally valued whether you are male or female. Does that sound like a nice world? Would you like to live in that world? I would too. And
now you can close your eyes, and we're going to move on to culture number 2. Now imagine that you're placed early in life in groups with same-age peers. Your mom has to leave for very long periods of time every day, and you're cared for by someone that you don't know well, but she doesn't know well. Much of your food is manufactured, and you start your life with baby formula. Parents are the boss. Some bosses are strict, and some bosses just aren't paying any attention.
You have to go to school from an early age in order to gain advantages in life. You're taught through example to want power. Your mistakes and bad behavior are disciplined. You're allowed to play whenever you're not doing homework, lessons, or organized sports. You can join grown-up life when you graduate from high school, college, or graduate school. And if you're a female, your work is likely to be underpaid and underappreciated. So now Ruth Ann's going to go over some history about how we got from one place to another.
Did you like that second place? Did it sound a little familiar, though? Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. So, okay, we're gonna go back in time. We're gonna talk about human development from a Darwinian perspective. So Charles Darwin in the late 1800s came out with The Origin of the Species, the book that changed the world scientifically, helped us to understand kind of what our place in the world is. And the theory of evolution is based on the idea that natural selection happens through random genetic mutations. And the evolutionary process is preserving survival advantages. Every organism develops in a specific environmental niche, and those genetic adaptations take place over many, many generations very, very slowly. Most of the mutations that happen do not support survival, and are selected out of the gene pool by the death of, or the non-reproduction of those individuals. And then we came to understand evolution from the idea of the survival of the fittest, right? The fittest to that, actually to that environment. And I'm going to talk later about whether it really is about survival of the fittest. Actually, it's not about the fittest, meaning the meanest, baddest, man in town. It's the most adaptable. So the survival is about adapting to conditions that make growing up and reproducing possible. And it was when we developed agriculture that we started as a species to move away from that environmental niche that we actually developed to. But we're gonna move on to a new theorist that is going to inform this conversation we're having.
So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with John Bowlby. John Bowlby's the father of attachment theory. We were lucky enough to have his son, Sir Richard Bowlby, come and do the keynote presentation at the Rye Conference 4 years ago, I believe, or 5 years ago. John Bowlby was a British psychologist or a psychiatrist in post-war Britain. And after the war, he began working with children who were maladjusted and delinquent. He eventually became the director of what is the famed center, the Tavistock Center, and he was a consultant for many, many, many decades for the World Health Organization around issues of therapy and mental health for children. John Bowlby was set apart from his predecessors, Freud and the like, primarily because he used an ethological approach to looking at children's behavior, specifically separation behaviors and separation issues. He looked at the way the child's environment, the entire environment, affected their behavior and relations around separation. So this idea that there were environmental issues at play really came from Bowlby. And he became convinced throughout his research with families and children that attachment behaviors are relational, and they are intergenerationally transmitted from mother to baby primarily. And it's because of this intergenerational transmission of these behaviors that John Bowlby said one of the most brilliant things I think anyone in our field has said, except maybe Magda. She said that if a society values its children, it must cherish the parents because these behaviors are intergenerationally transmitted. So he believed that in addition to helping children cope with stress of separation, you had to work with the parents. He stated that children over time build an internal working model of the world, and that they develop certain internal behavioral systems through this working model. And this working model that children develop comes through their relationships with primary people in their lives, primarily the mother or an allo parent. And later in life, after the first 9 months, of course, there are secondary and tertiary people in the child's world, but this model primarily comes from the primary attachment figure, the mother, which is why we get all the blame for everything that goes wrong. He was influenced greatly by many, many people prior to him: Anna Freud, Renee Spitz, who did the hospitalism research, Christopher Heinecke, Robert Lind, Harry Harlow, and Conrad Lorenz, who did work on imprinting. He also worked, as we know, very closely with Mary Ainsworth, who met and began working with Bowlby after the war. She's a Canadian-American researcher, and she, using his work on attachment theory, developed 3 different types of attachment. Now I believe there are 4, and her types of attachment were secure, ambivalent, and avoidant, and now I believe that there's a 4th, which is disorganized. John Bowlby said that behavior systems can adapt, and this is a quote, so I need to look at this. Behavior systems can adapt in greater or lesser degrees to changes in the child's environmental circumstances, provided that they don't deviate too much from the organism's environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So this term, environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, is a Bowlby term. He brought it to our attention back in the 1950s. These behavioral systems are supported by the relationship with the mother, and they can be subverted from their optimal path of development if we deviate too much from the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. John Bowlby also recognized that in humans, the EEA resembles that of primitive and present-day hunter-gatherer societies. He was a key influencer in evolutionary biology, and I also want to point out that he said that species prior to humans, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're not there yet.
No, just go back 1 second. Prior to human species, the nest was the safe haven in times of danger and insecurity. But for a child, the mother takes the place of what was once the nest. The mother is the safe haven for children. So we can go on. So if we move to then what Bowlby described as attachment behaviors, there are certain
See, I don't know how you do that.
We were going back and forth between a PC and a Mac, so we're working out the bugs.
So I'm there's Mac, she's a PC.
Yeah.
It's an evolutionary thing. I'm higher on the chain.
And I'm closer to the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. Anyway, so there are certain characteristics of attachment theory. Bowlby said that children are born with an innate developmental need that's been developed over many, many, many millennia for attachment to a primary person, and that person is the mother or an allo-parent. If you're not familiar with that term, it just means a mother substitute. Attachment behaviors. Children, we see these all the time in infants. They're smiling and cooing and laughing and touching, reaching, clinging. These are all attachment behaviors. John Bowlby said that any form of behavior that results in a person maintaining proximity to some other clearly identified person who is conceived as better able to cope with the world. That's an attachment behavior. So there's a proximity-seeking characteristic to attachment behaviors. Children, these attachment behaviors are activated by separation or perceived threat, which is part of what Mary Ainsworth did with her strange situation test. Children move back and forth between secure-based behaviors when they're near, seeking proximity to a person that they have a trusting relationship with, to exploring behaviors, and then when there is a separation or threat, they move into safe haven behaviors where they use the adult as a security figure so that they can regain their equilibrium. And the most important point here, I think, with all of Bowlby's research is that he has shown us that in order for children to thrive emotionally, they need to have, it's not best practice, they need to have a close and continuous relationship with someone they know and trust. It's not a best practice, it's a need. It's a fundamental human need.
So this big term that this whole presentation is based on, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, as Patty points out, was a concept that Bowlby came to after studying with all of these biologists and evolutionary biologists. And so every organism is shaped and molded by the very environment and the conditions in the environment in which they find themselves, right? So fish, evolved to get their oxygen from water, so they got gills, right? We evolved to breathe air because we were, came after those creatures that crawled out of the sea. Okay, so it gets very, very specific. What he said is not a single feature of a species' morphology, physiology, and behavior can be understood or even discussed intelligently except in relation to that species' environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So it's really important for us to become sensitive to these concepts because if we are, we can make more conscious, more conscientious decisions about what sort of environment it is we want to bring our babies up in. According to Allan Schore, who was a neuroscientist and psychologist, the EEA, and we'll call it the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness is a big word, operates within the mother-infant attachment bond at implicit nonverbal levels and molds postnatal right brain development, right? So Bowlby's work brought to light the understanding of human development that the central fact in our development is the emotional bond between the mother and the infant, and that is essential to all later functioning. So the mother is the principal element of the EEA. And I gotta, stop here and say, okay, well, we live in a world where some families don't have mothers. And I don't want to leave all those people outside the door that either are, a caregiving father or grandmother or a person who doesn't have a mother. It isn't that other people can't do the work of mothers, but we do need to keep in mind what those behaviors are that typically are mother behaviors that it needs to be taken into account if there's not a mother in the story, right? So dads need to channel, their inner mother if they're in charge of the young infant. And hopefully they had a mother, so, they can connect with that. Mothers have certain biological, evolutionary, genetic predispositions to care for infants as instinctively that maybe other people don't have. They have these cascades of oxytocin that come up, after childbirth and when you're breastfeeding, and oxytocin makes you feel love and, affection and closeness. But interestingly enough, I was at a conference at Notre Dame about this topic, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness and whether or not we're actually doing a good job for our kids. And I brought up the question of, what about people who aren't being cared for by a mother? What about that oxytocin, deficit? Should these caregiving dads get oxytocin nasal spray, which you can get on the internet? You can buy it. It's unregulated. It's not considered a drug. But they said, actually, interestingly, which is wonderful, oxytocin is produced through caregiving. And what's really cool is to tie that to Pickler. Dr. Pickler apparently was known to have said, mothers care because they love. Caregivers love because they care, right? So it works bidirectionally. So, you may not start off with that emotional feeling about that child in your program or, whatever. But through paying close attention to that child, you start to be producing that oxytocin that makes you feel connected. Yeah, I see you're nodding. Yes, that's wonderful. So I just don't want this to turn into some kind of, anti-male or, anti-grandmother sexist or, ageist diatribe. It's not meant to be that. We fully acknowledge that people who aren't mothers can take good care of babies. Okay, so let me see if there's anything else. Okay, so the bottom point in this is the most important thing we need to take away, is that in humans, the EEA includes caregiving behaviors that promote optimal postnatal brain development. What makes us different on the evolutionary scale from horses, for instance, is that, because we're two-legged creatures and we walk upright, the pelvic opening is so small that babies have to get born with their brains pretty small and unfinished. So the postnatal brain development that he was talking about this morning, 30,000 synapses per second is what a baby is building. Which is just amazing, because when you're thinking about a synapse is an actual physical structure. It's not just an event. It's an event, but it also builds the structure of the brain. So all that tripling in size that he showed us this morning on those slides is because of experiences. And, okay, I'm gonna, what is it? So I'm going to go, again, did the term affective neuroscience mean anything to any of you? Have you heard that term before? It's a relatively new science that has emerged really since probably starting in the mid-'80s. And the decade of the brain was considered the '90s, right? Jaak Panksepp wrote and published a book in 1994 or 8, called Affective Neuroscience. And he has studied animals, mammals, particularly small mammals, to understand the brain structure and the genetic predispositions that we would call instinct, right? And because we are mammals, we have the same. And he started off kind of with the idea that, psychologists talk about animals having proto-emotions. But he says, if it looks like an emotion and it quacks like an emotion, it's an emotion. Animals have feelings. And he was trying to get to the bottom of what are the basic emotional predispositions of mammals, and we're them. So here's what he came up with. He came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so the first one, what these are is that these are primary processes, meaning unlearned. And then the minute that you start utilizing that instinct, you start learning, and it starts changing. But what's there that does not need, Magda used to, really talk about trusting the child's inner drive, right? Well, some of the inner stuff, the seeking system. So that one kind of permeates several of the other systems. But that means the creature does like that little mouse we saw that wants to go and find out what's in the environment, what's out there. And that is a basic mammalian predisposition. Rage is a basic mammalian predisposition. People go, where did he get that aggression? Where did he learn to hit? It's like, he didn't have to learn that. That's part of our genetic pre-wired or whatever. Fear is one, when there seems to be threat to survival, that we all feel fear. Lust. And there are even those who believe that even infants and young children actually have those feelings. Care. So that's what we would call the maternal instinct or the parental instinct to take care of the young. And then panic at separation. Panic is that feeling that you have that you're all alone in the world and you can't cope. So, and then the last one is play, which is wonderful. But all mammals play, and we're mammals. And in fact, Panksepp believed that play is one of the most important ways to help us become socialized. And he has a lot to say, and he's going to be our keynote speaker at the conference next year. So you're going to get to hear Panksepp. So I'm super excited about that. So here's another one of my teachers, Allan Schore, who is considered the American Bowlby, or the father of regulation theory, but he wrote the foreword to the new edition of Bowlby's book, Attachment and Loss. And he's a psychoanalyst and a neuroscientist, and has written numerous big fat books on how behavior and experience shapes the brain. So he has taken and correlated Bowlby's work with the affective neuroscience and integrated it into something called regulation theory. So he says the experience of being with a regulating or dysregulating other is incorporated into an enduring interactive representation, which is what Bowlby called the internal working model, right? So just quick rundown. So the whole idea is that the brain is an experience-dependent organ, and we actually have fewer genes than we thought when they mapped the genome. They thought they were going to come up with about 100,000 genes in the human genome, but they only found 22,000, which was a big surprise because we make 100,000 proteins. And what genes are is a template for the creation of proteins in our cells. And so they had to start looking at, well, how come we make all those different proteins if we only have 22,000 genes? And so the effect of the environment on the cellular level tells the genes how to express themselves. So genetics isn't just, as simple as all that. So you can, have perfect genome, you can have a perfect genotype, but if your experiences, which includes, nutrition, it includes, whatever toxins are in the environment, and it includes the behavioral component too, okay, are going to shape how those genes express themselves. So, a person might get cancer that if they'd had a different experience or a different environment would not get cancer. It's not that they had a gene that said you're going to get cancer. They had a gene that if it expressed itself in a certain way, it would get cancer, and it required certain conditions to turn it on in that way. So that's what this is all about, is like, what are the conditions that are going to turn a baby's genes on in such a way as to build the best biology, right? So the quality of care an infant receives influences the early forming right brain development. So that's another one of Schore's big contributions, is that he brought together all of the studies showing that the right hemisphere is what is in busily being built in the first 2 to 3 years of life. So all the, interest that people have in cognitive neuroscience about, how they learn and, reading and all of that stuff, when I look at those pictures of parents reading with their kids, with their babies, I could care about the actual language. What I care about is that baby is feeling held and is feeling, loved out of the interaction of that. So I always say it's better to read the baby than to read to the baby. But anyway, so where was I? Healthy attachment is built through interactions with caregivers who not only help the infant down-regulate those fear and panic responses. This is another aspect of Schore's work that's meant a lot to me. And it does kind of build on Rye's message, because Rye, Bowlby kind of missed that piece, actually, that the upregulation of positive affect is also one of the functions of the child's, caregiving system. So helping the child to really fully experience joy is as important as helping the child not feel terrified. So it's both and, it's not either or. Okay, so and then we hear, oh yes, the brain is plastic, neuroplasticity, the brain is a changeable organ, for good or ill, right? Because if it's all going well and then something terrible happens, the plasticity of the brain means, that person's is gonna have a setback in their development. And people always say, oh, children are so resilient. Well, if they're using that word as a synonym for adaptable, maybe it's true, but true resilience means that you can overcome negative experiences to have a happy life, right? So children who have a baseline of secure attachment are more resilient than children who have a baseline of insecure attachment. And that's just brain science. So, anyway. Okay. Here we go. So what I'm trying to do here, what we're trying to do is tie together, the fact that the brain, that our genetic evolution is very slow means basically that biologically, Melanie Snell's 3-week-old baby that was walking around in there, did you see her? Oh my gosh, she's precious. Is genetically basically no different than a hunter-gatherer child 30,000 years ago. We have the same needs that we had then.
And that's why Bowlby said that present-day man, present-day babies, are much more closely linked to primitive man than to perhaps the way our society has developed in the last 200 years, that our children have not evolved into new species of people who are going to learn from technology because we've had a technological life for 200 years. So that's what Bowlby meant, is that we're much more connected to prehistorical man.
Right. So when you think about the brain and the prefrontal cortex, and those frontal lobes are much later forming. So what's forming in an infant is the early lower down parts of the midbrain, particularly the brainstem is good, the heart, the breathing, that's happening when they're born, but all of that emotional part of the brain that helps to regulate those instincts of, lust, seeking, play, panic, fear, rage, care, those are the parts of the brain that are being formed through experience. And what's great about that is that that's the only reason we can have different cultures. We have different cultures because of that neuroplasticity, has anybody seen that movie Babies, the documentary? Okay, like that baby in Africa couldn't be a happier. The mother is happy, right? I was raised more like that little Tokyo kid or more like that little San Francisco kid, and I would have been you put me out there on the bush and tell me to sit, with my back against a tree for 6 hours, I'm going to be going out of my mind, right? Because that's not the environmental niche in which I developed my need for stimulation and the rhythmicity of my life. But, if you took that same infant and shipped him off to San Francisco, he'd do all the same stuff that I do, or, that those kids do. So it's like the language, that they come in with a capacity to learn any language on the planet.
And having said that, we have flexibility in our development. We have flexibility in our development, but just going back to your two cultures slide, Ruth Ann, we have evolved to need much more of the kinds of experiences that you heard Ruth Ann talking about in that first culture, the slowness and the
freedom,
and yes, those kinds of things. We still carry those evolutionary needs. So having said that, we're very flexible in terms of our cultural adaptation. We still, as a species, are much more closely linked to those needs that are primitive. So.
Right. So back in the day, agriculture and industry were yet to be invented, and so what that really meant is that people didn't really work long hours at jobs that children couldn't go to, right? Food was acquired through hunting and gathering and what grew naturally. So they hadn't poured chemicals into their earth yet. Everything was healthy. One of my little favorite pieces of environment or of evolutionary history that I like to share with parents is how picky 2-year-olds get about food. And that's an evolutionary adaptation because they're not staying as close to the parents anymore after that age, and so they have to get a little careful about what things they'll pick up and eat. So that's an evolutionary, survival mechanism of toddlers that would be more on their own in the environment than under, an adult's careful scrutiny all the time.
That's good. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Food was scarce, they did have some bad things. They practiced infanticide. If they didn't have enough food for the kids that had made it to age 1, they just didn't feed the new babies. So it's not like it was a perfect world. I certainly don't want to go and live like a hunter-gatherer, but they didn't have medicine. I think competition was it happened on a different level because the population was low. So there wasn't the one-upsmanship that we have now to get advantages. I think they were more cooperative. Humans developed the qualities and skills not just to survive, but to thrive. And a lot of that had to do with cooperative behavior. So the family values that you would have had in our evolution, our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, boys and girls were equally valued as children. Mothers kept their babies close to them and responded quickly to their needs. Mothers had a lot of help from alloparents. An alloparent is a father, a grandmother, a neighbor, somebody who was invested in the child for the long term. A member of the community that was going to either reap the benefits of having this as a upstanding citizen or, suffer the consequences of their not being. Fathers were very involved in child caregiving, actually, with infants too. Punishment was not how they trained children. Cooperation and autonomy were equally important. So children were encouraged to cooperate, but they were not forced to comply. Play was something that happened all the time. Everybody in the society played. So that created a joyful experience. No one exercised authority over anybody else, but cooperation was encouraged through gentle teasing. If anyone started acting self-important, it's kind of interesting. And there are cultures, that I'm had a little familiarity with that do that to this day. That are not the American mainstream individualist. We prize you the most if you're the best at something. We need to learn from those cultures, I think. Peter Gray, who's a psychologist who writes about this topic, says he came up with 3 theories as to why hunter-gatherers, how they managed to retain their egalitarian, non-hierarchical way of being as a society. And first of all, they did practice this reverse dominance that prevented people from assuming power over other people, and that kind of teasing was one of it. And then the social play, the fact that everybody played means that you set aside your hierarchy. You set aside the fact, if I'm going to play tag with somebody, you have to sometimes slow down to give the other person a chance to get away, right? That if it's play, you do that. If it's real competition, you don't, right? So it's the playful activity that makes people hold back from using their advantages. Then where's my, there it is, okay. And then the third way that he talked about is in their child-rearing practices, which basically engendered feelings of trust and acceptance in each new generation. So some people would call that kind of parenting as permissive, but Peter Gray called it trusting. And the fact that the first principle of RIE is trust in the child,
And according to Eric Erickson, it is the first goal of psychosocial development as well.
Right. So they trusted the infant's instincts, and that's what we do. Okay, so here we go. So this is our history. So we're moving on.
So you may be asking yourself at this point, okay, you may say, okay, EEA, Environment of Evolutionary Adaptiveness, that's kind of cool term, but why do I need to know this, and why is this important? I work with children full-time, why do I need to know this? I'm a full-time mom, why do I need to know this? So now we're going to move on to some of the things that are happening in our modern world and two people we're going to talk about right now are Dr. Emmy Pickler and Magda Gerber, who, though they were not aware of neuroscience or research in neuroscience, based upon their observation of children and their understanding of child psychology, they naturally put in place principles and practices that supported the very evolutionary needs that all children have. And so now we're going to talk about how Dr. Pickler and Magda Gerber were bridges from our basic needs to our current practices, I believe. So let's talk about, this is Dr. Pickler, who died in 1984. Who's familiar with Dr. Pickler? Are most of you pretty familiar? Everybody's heard of her. Okay, so.
Not everybody.
Not everybody. Dr. Pickler was a pediatrician in Budapest, Hungary, and she actually became Magda Gerber's pediatrician over a funny story, which I won't go into, but she became Magda Gerber's pediatrician. And
For her children, not herself.
thank you, yes, for her children. Her oldest daughter, Mayo, got sick, and their pediatrician wasn't available, so she called Dr. Pickler, who was I am telling the story, who was a friend of, the mother of one of Mayo's friends, and Dr. Pickler, I guess, came to Magda's house, and she wanted to know what was wrong with Mayo. She had a sore throat, and Magda started to answer, and anyone who knew Dr. Pickler knew that she just went, shh. She did not want to hear from the adult. She asked Mayo, what's wrong? And she involved Magda's daughter in the process of identifying her health issues, which astounded Magda and was the basis for a lifelong friendship between the two of them. So Dr. Pickler was a pediatrician in Budapest, Hungary, and after the war, after World War II, the Hungarian government asked her to come in and start an orphanage for children whose parents had either been killed in the war or were otherwise unable to care for them. And this is in a devastated Budapest, Hungary after World War II, where buildings were crumbling down around them still. And Dr. Pickler founded what was then called the National Methodological Institute of Residential Nurseries. And they just call it LOXI. Now we call it the Pickler Institute. It's been named after Dr. Pickler since her death. LOXI was the name of the street that the Pickler Institute is on, and many of us at RIE have studied with her daughter Anna Tardos and with Dr. Pickler as well in Budapest. Dr. Pickler did a few things that were really astounding. First, she documented the natural progression of gross motor development. And I've done a little bit of research on this, and I can't find anything prior to Dr. Pickler's ethological, thank you, research, which is observational research, to document the progression of natural gross motor development, which influences the way children relate and play. She was very, very, very well aware of the studies that Renee Spitz had done on hospitalization prior to and after the war. And she instituted some policies that she believed would help children overcome some of the traumas of poor early care. So she instituted what she called primary baby nurses. We call it now primary caregiving, and that is where a single person or two people, or since this was a 24-hour residential center, 3 people, had a small group of children, small is relative, small group of children who they took care of. They provided all of the caregiving activities and routines for these children, and they were sort of assigned to these children since they were orphans as essentially alloparents. So she instituted primary caregiving, and it was not a common practice in 1945. She also instituted continuity of care, though she didn't. We have Ron Lawley to thank for the term, but she instituted continuity of care where the primary baby nurses remained with these children throughout their time in the orphanage. They stayed with them because Dr. Pickler understood the value of that attached, trusting relationship and how important that is for the child's normal, healthy development. Their neurological development, their social emotional development, their affective development, their physical development. It's critical. So we really have Dr. Pickler to thank for those 2 practices, which I say time and time again, they're not best practices. They're necessary practices, and we have Dr. Pickler to thank for those. She also really believed in the value of sensitive, responsive caregiving. And though we are not going to show you a video of some of the caregiving routines at the Pickler Institute, if you ever have a chance to see any of these videos, if you believe as much as we do in the value of sensitive, responsive caregiving, these videos will bring you to tears. They're so lovely. She taught her nurses to spend enormous time and pay incredible sensitive attention to the children who they were caring for. And she did this because she knew that sensitivity and responsiveness were primary factors in the development of a secure attached relationship. And the last thing about Dr. Pickler is that she was a very good friend, mentor, and colleague to Magda Gerber. I guess there's one more thing. There is a connection between Bowlby and Pickler. They were contemporaries, and they actually sort of ran in that same circle of people over in Europe. There were 2 researchers, Genevieve Appel and Miriam David, who were colleagues of John Bowlby's and sat on a work group, a study group with him, and they went to Budapest, Hungary, and studied at the Pickler Institute and wrote about the exceptional care that the children in this orphanage were getting, and helped the World Health Organization document that the children who were coming out of this orphanage were, for probably the first time in the world, became productive citizens in their society to the same extent that every other person who was born into a family was able to assimilate into the society. So, though I don't know, and maybe you know, I don't know if Dr. Pickler was personally associated with Bowlby, there was a strong connection between them through the people of Genevieve Appel and Miriam David. So you want to talk about Magda?
Okay. So the reason we're all here is because Magda Gerber, having learned from Dr. Pickler and then having to leave Hungary in the aftermath of the Hungarian Revolution, came to the States in '56 and took her time to kind of get acquainted with the lay of the land here, but started teaching and working with parents in the 70s and founded RY in 78 with Dr. Tom Forrest, who was a pediatric neurologist in Stanford. And started really doing a lot of speaking and teaching, and her teaching and her speaking very subtly but very profoundly influenced the developmentally appropriate practices outline that, is published by NAEYC and whatnot. So Magda was, really the mother of developmentally appropriate practice in the United States, but kind of uncredited in a way, and I think it was almost deliberate. Many, many people in this country have contributed to, the infant family field, and I don't want to say other people's contributions weren't also profound, but Magda was really, really important early on as, because what happened in our society is that mothers started going to work, right? And they started having to find people to take care of their children that they weren't related to, because not everybody had a mother or aunt that could do the job. So, that field, although it had been pretty well developed during the Second World War, after the war, they closed all of the child care centers and sent all the mothers back home, and those mothers that was like my mother kind of weren't too happy with that. And the quote-unquote women's liberation movement happened, and women said, we need to have the same opportunities everybody else has. And that's a double-edged sword. It's politically incorrect to talk about the idea that babies need their mothers, because that also is an oppression of women topic. I'm not scared to engage in that conversation. I don't know the answer. I do not know the answer. But we all together need to come up with better answers than what we've got going now, because it's not going well for children. Thank you. Yeah. I learned in my Allan Schore study group, this will knock your socks off, 35% of teenagers test as avoidantly attached in our country. That's insecure avoidant. Insecure avoidant is narcissism. It's where narcissism comes from. It's where not caring about your neighbors comes from. It's about looking out for number one is all that matters. That's where it comes from. It's not they're bad people. They did not get cared for in ways that taught them to look to other people to feel good with. So that insecure avoidant attachment is what people end up with, or in adulthood it's called dismissive, which none of us likes to be around a person that just dismisses us as unimportant or unnecessary. But so what I'm not blaming any particular person. I'm not saying it's not about casting blame. It's about what do we do about it? What do we do about it now? We can't keep going this direction, because we need people who care deeply about other people that maybe, aren't there, don't live in their house with them, We need people to have a wider cast to their empathy than that. And it starts in infancy, and how we take care of babies is how our world is going to be. And we got some crises happening right now. So anyway, mine and Patty's whole thesis of this talk is that educaring offers a way to conceptualize a bridge between the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness and, modern times. So there's ancient needs at play that aren't any different than they ever were, but conditions are really different now than they were,
How many hours a day are 3-year-olds or 2-year-olds watching television? That's not meeting any need.
Right.
Yeah, so educating bridges, go back.
Yeah. So what educaring does is recognizes the centrality of primary relationships in infants' lives, in children's lives, right? It's built on those instincts that Panksepp outlined, that are genetic predispositions. It's built on trust in the child's innate drive toward maturity. And that's the seeking system and all of those systems at play. We offer children autonomy through free play and free movement and uninterfered with movement and play. That speaks to that EEA, sort of milieu where children were allowed to just be. And then the sensitive caregiving promotes cooperation. So it's not just all autonomy, it's autonomy and cooperation. It promotes empathy and perspective taking because we're emotionally honest with children. Because of authenticity, children will not be, because of our emotional presence and emotional authenticity, children will not be inclined to be dismissive of other people because they can handle it. And then educaring fosters self-regulation through selective intervention. Sometimes we help and sometimes we don't, and that's based on what we think the child could do for him or herself, In a lot of my other PowerPoint presentations, I do a little slide about what is self-regulation. Self-regulation isn't just all I'm doing it. Self-regulation is a combination of auto-regulation, in which I'm doing it all by myself, and or interactive regulation, where I'm, my emotional state is being helped by my relationship with another person. So if I'm super upset, if I'm a little upset, I can, go take a dance class and calm myself down, and that's, well, actually those dance people are co-regulating with me. Okay, let me think. I could take a bath, and that might calm me down, or a shower. But if I'm really upset, I need to call my husband, and get a little interactive regulation. So what we want is for children to form a healthy balance between auto-regulation and interactive regulation. The anxiously attached person always needs somebody in their stuff, and they've got to have, somebody to complain to, and somebody, they're really seeking external regulation. And the avoidantly attached person is always, don't worry, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. Did you need something? In there with their thing. So a lot of the iPhones and iPads and things are promoting and making people who are avoidantly attached really comfortable in the world. Actually, it really promotes that comfort level with, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. And then having a simple environment that's natural and nurturing. And that's like going back to the olden times, but it doesn't have to be, in the dirt heap. We can have a modern day space, and if you've ever seen a Rye-influenced space, you understand what simple, nurturing, beautiful spaces are, for children. So I think educaring is going the right direction.
And bridges those are basic needs with a world environment right now that perhaps takes us far, far away from our needs. So that's okay. So what is Magda's legacy? And I'll go just through this really quickly because we're coming close to the end. Rye. Excuse me, take these off. Rye encourages cooperation, collaboration, not competitiveness, creativity, resourcefulness, the self-regulation and co-regulation that Ruth Ann was talking about, autonomy that's gained through interdependent relationships. So it's not individualism.
It's respect for others, mutual understanding of the self and of other people through observation and the socialization process. Trust in yourself and trust in others. It's what Erickson called basic trust. Exploration and the assurance of the secure base in those times of separation and distress, and selective intervention as a pro-social model for co-regulation. So what we want to do now is look at just a couple of practices that we believe also bridge these ancient needs with what's happening in the world today. So these practices will help children get through some of the stresses of our modern day environment and go back and meet some of these ancient needs. And the first is primary caregiving, and we've talked a lot about this, but here's what I'm going to say about this, and I might ruffle some feathers. If you work in group care and you work in a center that does not have primary caregiving, you are not meeting the needs of children. I'm sorry. It might be a great center. We've all seen great centers. But if you don't have primary caregiving, you need to go back and on a daily or weekly basis, when you're in those staff meetings, you just keep saying, when are we doing primary caregiving? We need primary caregiving. And it can't be well, yeah, we're going to work on it. No. It must be a policy because it meets a basic survival need for children, a social emotional need for children. So I'm going to say it again, if you work in a center, you don't have primary caregiving, you have to do better. Because, mothers can make a lot of mistakes. Mothers don't have to be perfect because there's that primacy in the relationship. We're caring for other people's children, and we need to be very, very careful about establishing and proactive about establishing those relationships. So I would say primary caregivers, go back and pound on your directors. We've got to have it.
Fight for it.
Fight for it. Parents, when you go visit a center, when you have little babies, the very first question out of your mouth is, do you have primary caregiving and continuity of care? And if the answer is no, you say, thank you very much for your time. It looks like a lovely place. I must go. I'm going to find another place, because it has to start at a grassroots level. The frontline caregivers and the parents have to start fighting for basic needs of children.
The rights of children.
The rights of children. And attachment is a basic need. And so I get teary because we just have to do this. Parents care. We've got to fight.
And I'm just going to add that, if you're the parent and you're asking the question, do you do primary caregiving? They'll say yes, and they're not doing it. So you have to say, well, what do you mean by that? So you have to follow it up with another question. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And if they're not saying, well, each caregiver has a small group of children for whom she is primarily responsible. That's what it means.
And I think Ruth Ann may have made this point earlier, but caregivers are not interchangeable. Primary caregivers means that children go through fewer transitions of people throughout the course of their lives, and they need those stable relationships. So caregivers are not interchangeable. I used to work at a lab school at university, and God bless us, we did the best we could, but we had lab students coming in every 2 hours. And so these babies were sometimes being held just in one day, by, 10, 15 people. Anyway, so that's primary caregiving, really important. The other one is continuity of care. It's the second question. Do you have continuity of care? Because the relationship that the child forms with that primary caregiver in the first year of life in group care needs to be sustained. So caregivers, if you work in a center and you don't have continuity of care, as soon as you stop haranguing the director about primary caregiving, start haranguing them about continuity of care, because it's super important. It's just really, really important. It's important for the development of the child's sense of self, of the child's sense of self in relation to another person. It's about trust. It's about mutual co-regulation. There are just so many things that are important about primary caregiving. And you might think to yourself, why does she have a picture of a couple of kids up there with blocks? Because this is another element of continuity of care. I think I just said primary caregiving. This is another element of continuity of care. The story behind this is simple. These two little boys, I'm trying to remember their names. Isn't that terrible? You just forget. Jacob and Anthony, I think. Anthony is the little boy in the white shirt. So Jacob is building a very tall tower with blocks. These kids are, what would you say, 18 months, maybe 2 at the most. He's building a very tall tower with blocks by himself in a certain area of the room. And Anthony comes over, and he's got that look in his eye. He's a toddler, like, oh, a tall tower, and I'm going to knock it down. And he's going in to knock it down. And his caregiver, lovely, she's here today, she's a RI associate, his caregiver, who has been the caregiver for these boys since they were 3 months old, is sitting on the other side of the camera, and she says very quietly, Anthony, Jacob's building a tall tower. Let's see what happens. And he stops and he looks at her, and he does exactly what Dimitri Christakis was saying today. He delays that need to go in and knock it over, and he waits and he stops until the last tower goes on, and then the boys look at each other, and then they pummel the whole thing and it goes falling to the ground. But that's what happens when children have continuity of care. They listen.
Can you just say what age you mean when you speak of continuity?
Yeah, to age 3. So Bertha 3.
And that being that, as Magda used to say, well, if they can talk, they can tell you what they don't like. That as long as a child is in a language learning modality, it requires a sensitive adult to be able to read their cues and to respond appropriately to them. So when the 12-month-old gets sent from the bunnies to the foxes, he has to go over there and train a whole new group of grown-ups to his cues. And so it's going to set him back. Yeah. It's going to set him back emotionally and cognitively. Yeah, Gilda. Should we hold her up? You know what? We're just like 2 slides from ending, and then we'll do questions.
Sorry.
Okay.
Because the last one, for free play, I'm going to go through this really quickly. Free movement and play, really basically, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but when children are allowed to move freely and play freely, they just gain so many skills. And Magda Gerber said that children learn in time, not on time, so let's give them time to play, just like our prehistoric ancestors did when they let their children be children and play. And the last practice is selective intervention, and this is really important. We talk about this a lot at RI. We train caregivers on how to do this. It is we intervene in a child's uninterrupted play only in certain instances. And I'll just tell you the quick story. The story is the little boy in the green. He's going up the ramp, and his plan is to go down the slide. The little boy in the red is to go, up the stairs and down the ramp, and they meet in the middle. And they have a little incident. And the other little boy gets pushed back, and once again, I'm so sorry, I can't remember their names anymore. So in this process, there was a conflict that happened between these 2 little boys. So where's the adult, and what's her role? And this is her role. She was right there the whole time. She was sitting nearby. She was giving them information. She was telling them what was happening. She was saying, Jacob, you're going up the ramp, and now you're coming down the stairs. And Thomas, you are coming up the stairs, and Jacob's coming down the ramp. What's going to happen? She's giving them information, not talking, it's not a verbal vomit. She's not talking nonstop. But when they have this collision, she's giving them information, and then she doesn't do anything. She just is there. So her role, according to Magda Gerber, gives them this message. I'm with you.
I'm right here. I'm not going to abandon you, but I'm also not going to take over your learning process. So that's selective intervention. And these are the policies that, that selective intervention really is a training process. That's something that most adults need to learn to do because we tend to be a little too intrusive in children's play. But these other policies are things that we truly need to fight for. I hate to use the word fight. That's not the right. I don't want to be aggressive. We truly advocate for. Thank you. In the video, can you just make fight advocate? We need to advocate for.
Yeah.
So
this is,
yeah,
right?
that's
So this
for
is,
that.
no, this is,
We're running out of time.
I know, but this is our wrap-up. So this is what we need, these are policy changes that are going to get us back closer to the EEA. These are not undoable things. They are just practical things that can fit into a modern culture if the culture has the will, okay? And that is a policy change that gives parental leave to all American parents, okay? Paid parental leave for, a year minimum. Just like in Europe. We could do that. We have the money, we just don't allocate it that way. Yes. Government subsidies for infant care programs, infant toddler care programs, because maybe not every single parent is best suited to stay home, and some children are going to go into child care. Those need to be well-funded and not by individual families. Well-educated child care workforce. Thank you for being here. Worthy wages for all child care providers, yes, so that it's a respectable and living. Quality standards, including primary caregiving, continuity of care, and free play for the first 3 years. Child care administrators providing support for the caregivers, and integrating the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere in our society, the head and the heart. So,
And we wanted to thank you for coming, and I wanted to wrap up by just sharing 2 quotes. One from Dimitri Christakis this morning. He said, when you change the beginning, you change the whole story. That's what we're doing at Ryan, that's what you guys are doing. And Magda Gerber said that with infants and toddlers, the care cannot be adequate, it has to be excellent. So, that's it.
so thank you. And then we'll do questions.
And we know we're preaching to the choir.
Yeah. But it's nice to see heads nodding.
It is, and we
And
can.
it's nice that not too many people left, so.
All right. So I know
So,
we're running.
Gilda, you ready to?
Yeah, thank you. So my question was, the other person, I think, asked a question about the continuity of care. You were saying up until 1, but then I also heard up until 3. So if a parent then, has the fortune of staying home with their child up until 3, then that would be the recommended thing to do. To not go to preschool until after 3.
I'm not necessarily saying that. I would recommend a child being in the home for at least the first year and a half. If it was a happy home and the person that was taking care of him wanted to be there, that to me is the best of all possible worlds. But
We don't have policies that support this right now, though, and we're living in the real world. We know parents, moms, we're not saying moms stay home, we're not saying that, but, we do need to provide support for those who can and want to, but we don't. John Bowlby said if we value our children, we have to cherish the parents, and Ruth Ann's talking about all these policies. So we need to start making some changes. But a lot of the research right now is suggesting, it looks like, that in that first year of life, unless the quality of child care changes drastically, and it must, really.
right, so a few hours a day, 4 to 6 hours a day of good quality care, a child can thrive in that, I believe,
It's the quality of the program that creates the problem for the
Right.
child.
Anybody else have any thoughts? It doesn't have to be a question, it could just be a comment.
I'm sure you're aware of the universal preschool idea for 4-year-olds up, which may be too academic. Is there any federal legislation supporting, like Lally's idea and your ideas about teaching parents directly and having them stay at home and do this incredible work?
I don't know.
Gail, do you know, we have someone here who works in administration. Gail, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you know anything about this?
Well, I know that PITC is strongly coming out with a home visiting model. So that is the next step.
A home visiting model, oh, yeah.
Yeah, the PITC, which is the training consortium here in California, supports all of the infant toddler caregivers. They are coming out with a PITC Institute around home visiting. So they're really raising that idea up further, that really going into the home and making that connection is vital to the child.
Right. But in terms of of like legislation that, I don't know that there's any, I know that there was something recently on the federal government having to do with infant toddler care subsidy programs, but I don't know the details. Huh? For our babies, right? Yeah. Okay, we got to follow up and then we'll go over here.
It just seems incredibly important that if we're behind this, we need to find out who our legislators are, because the money is going to be taken up for those
Right.
4-year-old preschools,
Right.
publicly funded preschools. So I think it's important to become political and find this stuff.
Right. Yeah, because I really think that early, universal preschool is great, but it's too late. It's too late. Okay.
If you're the kind of person who can work with not everybody feels like they can do that, but if you're the kind of person who feels like they can call your legislator.
Well, she's in Sacramento, too.
I know she is, I know. She lives in my town.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a comment and maybe a tip. I know that you're trying to focus on the behaviors that are, that are human in terms of human development from an evolutionary perspective, and the mother-baby relationship, and essentially mimic a lot of that, right? And we try to kind of mimic those types of behaviors that are hard to implement in our society right now. And I think that one of those things is very important that is not so accepted by RIE, or I don't want to say it like that, but it's not promoted as much by RIE, is breastfeeding.
Oh, we're totally behind it.
Right, but if you look at the picture here, right, also, I wonder why it's not a breast.
It's a caregiver. It's a caregiver.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I kind of want to focus on, that I think, I do in my family, and I promote it from not only a behavioral perspective, but from a medical perspective.
Yeah.
And the World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding for 2 years, right? So it's only in the American Pediatric Association that's 1 year.
Right.
And I just think that it's something that really makes it obvious that the mother needs to be there.
Okay, I totally agree with you. At the same time, I hate, like, when a mom says to me, well, I couldn't breastfeed, and, I feel like I'm not trying to heap guilt on anybody.
Of course, and that's not the issue. The issue is just saying what is
policy
optimal,
and support is really important on that. At the conference I went to at Notre Dame on the EEA, a worldwide breastfeeding expert got up and said, we need to stop talking about the importance of breastfeeding. We need to start talking about the dangers of not breastfeeding. She's changing her tone too. I'm changing my tone. Patty and I are like on the page, primary caregiving, continuity of care. If you're going to do child care, that needs to be it. And the breastfeeding experts are feeling the same way about that.
I actually have a follow-up to that. I think what I hear with regards to RIE and breastfeeding is people think that RIE is not breastfeeding friendly because we do not advocate feeding the child whenever they cry. And that's something that you might see in one of those primitive societies, but there are children's needs that were not met in those societies. There are children's rights that they couldn't meet. like letting your child cry could attract a predator. We don't have those problems anymore. We can feed children only when they're hungry, not just when they're upset. And so in RIE, they do advocate feeding on demand whenever the child is hungry, and breastfeeding is best, but not just every time the child cries.
Good point. Good.
Okay.
My question is just simple. How many culture adapting RIE?
That's not simple.
And it's complex. I
okay,
mean,
you
I'm
know,
just
right
not from
now-
this culture. I'm just wondering how we are reaching out other countries. What are we doing?
We're just, first of all, we're trying to get here, first of all. It's not exactly mainstream here yet. Janet Lansbury's been helping a lot with that, with her blog. But,
You know, she just had to leave.
yeah, she's presenting later on, so she probably had to go get ready.
I think RIE RIE and Pickler are expanding all over the globe, but I live in China. I'm not a China expert, but I spent a little time looking at the family structure and the mother-child relationship and the difference in the relationships. And I think that we need to be very, very careful when we're approaching any culture, even a subculture of the American culture, and saying, with the exception of primary caregiving and continuity of care, that you must do things one way, or one way is best for all children. There's no one way to raise children that's right for all cultures. And so, you know, I know we're going to start working over in China with some colleagues. And will it ever be RIE? It's Chinese. It's going to be Chinese. So
And
I don't know if that answers your question,
but there are people in, you know, Australia and New Zealand who are studying and bringing RIE into their child care programs. In Europe, certainly Europe has got Pickler, you know, sprinkled throughout.
But
in
it is a
South
Western
America,
model.
Brazil, Ecuador, there are, you know, and I think trying to figure out how to be culturally relevant while, you know, promoting.
While not ethnocentric.
Yeah, and not ethnocentric is tricky. So it's a good question.
Yeah, it's a tough question too. So there's nothing simple about that question.
How do we go about determining then which RIE practices can be used cross-culturally, or which ones we need to modify to specific cultures? Does that make sense? Like,
I'll tell you. Okay, can I? Well, yeah. I mean, it's partly listening deeply to the families that you serve. You know, so you know, trying to be on board with their values. At the same time, you're going to have some center values that are yours that, you know, you're not going to budge on certain things. You know, but the whole auto-regulation versus interactive regulation adding up to self-regulation, that is a very cultural mix. So I had a colleague who I would go in after class and it was time to do the dishes, and I'd get there and I'd start doing the dishes, and then she'd come over and she'd stand this close to me and start doing the dishes too. And I'd go do something else. You know, I've got this, right? And it dawned on me, oh, she's Mexican. She comes from a huge family. Being together and doing the dishes together is meaningful to her. To me, having this space and getting it all set up the way I wanted and doing it, you know, and then I could start laughing at myself for my, you know, my cultural bias. So, you know, I think communication and then having authenticity. If you don't think you can meet the needs of a family because they want their kid to drill and rehearse math 3 hours a day when they're 2.5, maybe you need to find a different center. That's not what we do. I mean, you know, you can't meet You can't fulfill everybody's wishes. You have to have your own core.
And it's an important part of our job is to do whatever we can to maintain that parent-child relationship. It's still the most enduring primary relationship that any human being will ever have is with their parent. So, yeah. But I think it's communication. I don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think really, I'm not a RIE trainer, but I've been coming around RIE for a few years. And really what we have to do is practice those 3 R's, the respectful, reciprocal relationships with each other, with parents, with children. And for me, because I'm not an official RIE center and I'm not officially RIE trained, I have to bring myself back there and kind of reconsider, how do I do this in the culture that I'm part of, where I work with teachers and families and children, and a culture that existed before I came on board, and some of them buy into RIE and some of them don't. It's just those 3 R's, the respectful, reciprocal relationship piece. We have to practice it across the board with all of each other, and then we are RIE.
Thanks,
you, Deborah.
That's so beautiful, and it doesn't matter. I mean, we promote RIE, we love RIE, we love the educating approach, but absolutely right. What matters is the relationship. It doesn't matter what you call it, if you're responsive, respectful. Yeah.
One more?
Anything else before? Are we missing?
She's got
lunch
one
now?
more. I don't know. Because yeah.
We don't need lunch.
My stomach's growling, actually. Speak for yourself, Patty.
Thank you, ladies. I was just going to suggest that reciprocal relation, the respectful relationship, doesn't always have to expand to your legislators, because sending a fax, even if you're not comfortable calling a legislator, sending a fax right before some of your legislation comes up. I live in Sacramento, and lobbyists talk around you all the time. You hear this, that certain representatives, their fax machines go crazy with people that want them to vote a certain way. They have to hear from you personally.
Yeah,
So if you're not
I agree.
comfortable calling them, send them a fax.
Right.
Send them a fax, send them an email, be respectful, expect it to be reciprocal, but don't stop. And Patty, I appreciate your gentle approach when you say advocate for primary care and advocate for continuity of care, and we're also gentle in RIE, but I say fight for it. I think fight is an okay word, because these children don't have somebody, advocacy maybe falls short, maybe it is a fight to get them the permanency and the care that they need for those first couple of years. But thank you, it's been a great talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for validating my initial reaction.
I think there was one more hand up over here. Go ahead.
You know, my comment is more like a touchy-feely summary comment. And I think I got just a little uncomfortable when we started talking about looking at other cultures and trying to impose other things on them. That made me a little uncomfortable. And so I wanted to step back for a second, and I think when we look at any culture and when we go back to thinking of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, what seemed to work the best, whether you call it care or love, as a parent, you know, as a caregiver or a teacher, that's what we ultimately, right, hope to impart. And so maybe pathways may not look the same to impart that love or that care, but I think we have to honor perhaps those different pathways as well.
Thank you. Is that you, Lucy? Hi.
You just wrapped it up. We need to say nothing else.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.